The late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the busy streets of the city, as the hum of traffic and the buzz of pedestrians filled the air. A black police cruiser rolled down the road, its siren silent, but the officer behind the wheel was alert, scanning the crowd. Officer Griggs, a man in his early 30s, had spent years on the force, and he'd seen a lot. But today, something stood out to him. Up ahead, walking slowly down the sidewalk, was an elderly black man. His coat was old, worn from years of use, and his steps were deliberate. He moved with a quiet dignity, but Griggs, sitting in his car, felt an unusual frustration simmering inside him. There was something about the man that rubbed him the wrong way. Without thinking twice, Griggs pulled over and stepped out of the car. He slammed the door shut, making sure to grab the old man's attention. "Hey you!" Griggs called out, his voice loud, demanding. "Where do you think you're going?" The elderly man paused, turning to face the officer, his expression calm but wary. "I'm just walking, officer," he replied, his voice steady, a touch of exhaustion beneath the surface. "No harm in that." Griggs squinted, his eyes narrowing as he took in the man's appearance. He was clearly an older gentleman, weathered by time, but there was something about him that Griggs couldn't quite place. The officer's instinctual discomfort turned to disdain. "Don't try to act innocent," Griggs sneered, taking a few steps forward. "You got any ID on you?" The elderly man's eyes flickered, but he didn't flinch. "I don't need ID to walk down the street." Griggs stepped closer, his voice turning harsher. "I said show me your ID." "No." "I told you I'm just walking," the old man repeated, his tone measured, but Griggs could see the growing tension in his posture. "There's no reason for this." But Griggs wasn't listening. His mind was clouded with judgment, with assumptions. To him, the man was just another face on the street, another black man, just like so many others he had seen over the years. And in his eyes, that made him suspicious. "Turn around," Griggs barked suddenly, his hand reaching for the man's shoulder. "I'm checking you." The elderly man, feeling the pressure of the situation, resisted the urge to snap back. He wasn't going to be intimidated. Not today. He had lived too long to let some officer treat him like this. His heart beat faster, but his face remained impassive. Griggs shoved him again, this time harder. "What are you hiding, huh? You think you can just walk around like you own the place? You're nothing." The old man's fists clenched, but he didn't move. He had heard it all before. The words, the slurs, the insults. It was nothing new. But this time, something inside him snapped. "Get your hands off me," the elderly man said, his voice low but firm. "I've done nothing wrong." Griggs froze for a moment, caught off guard by the old man's resolve. But only for a second. His anger flared, and he shoved the man again, this time with more force. "Shut up. Just turn around." The elderly man stumbled, but quickly regained his balance. His eyes locked onto Griggs, and for the first time, Griggs saw something he didn't expect: defiance. It was in the old man's eyes, an unspoken challenge that made Griggs hesitate for just a moment. But before he could react, a car screeched to a halt behind them, its tires tearing through the air. A young man stepped out, his expensive suit crisp and clean against the dirty pavement. His face was tight with concern, his eyes scanning the scene quickly. "What's going on here?" the young man demanded, walking briskly toward the officer. Griggs, still seething, glanced at him and waved him off. "Mind your own business," he spat. But the young man wasn't backing down. "This is my business," he said, now standing next to the elderly man. He shot Griggs a look that made the officer take a step back. "What the hell are you doing?" the young man snapped. You have no right to treat my father like that." The word father hung in the air like a bomb, and Griggs froze. His gaze darted between the elderly man and the young man, his mind racing. For a split second, Griggs didn't understand. But then, realization hit him like a slap in the face. The old man wasn't just some nobody. He was Malcolm King, a well-known civil rights lawyer, a man whose name echoed in courtrooms and headlines. Griggs had just humiliated one of the most respected figures in the country. The young man's expression darkened. "You don't get to treat him like this," he said, his voice full of authority. "Not today. Not ever." Griggs stood motionless for a moment, his mind spinning. The world felt like it was tilting beneath him. The arrogance that had filled him just moments before began to crumble, replaced by a cold sweat of realization. The elderly man, Malcolm King, stared at Griggs with quiet fury. But he said nothing. He didn't need to. His son had spoken for him, and the truth had come crashing down on Griggs in a way he couldn't escape. Officer Griggs opened his mouth to apologize, but the words died in his throat. It was too late. The damage was done. The old man had been humiliated. His dignity had been stripped away. And all Griggs could do was stand there, stunned, as the consequences of his actions began to sink in. Malcolm King didn't say another word. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than anything he could have said. The young man, his son, glared at Griggs one last time before turning to his father. "Let's go, Dad," he said quietly. And together, they walked away. Griggs stood frozen, unable to move. The reality of what had just happened hit him like a wave. His prejudice, his quick judgment, his racist assumptions had led him to this moment. And now, there was no undoing it. The night had fallen by the time Officer Griggs returned to the precinct. The once bustling streets of the city now lay quiet, with only the occasional car passing by under the dim glow of street lamps. Griggs's cruiser rolled silently into the parking lot, the sound of the tires on the asphalt almost mocking him. He parked the car and sat there for a moment, staring ahead, unable to shake the events of the afternoon. His mind replayed every moment, the elderly man's calm demeanor, the way he'd stood tall in the face of Griggs's aggression, and that chilling realization when the young man had spoken. Malcolm King. The name echoed in his mind like a constant drumbeat. He had been so quick to judge, so sure of his own righteousness, but now he was left with nothing but a gnawing sense of shame. He had humiliated a man who had dedicated his life to justice, a man whose name carried weight in courtrooms across the nation. Griggs knew the consequences of his actions weren't just going to fade away. He could feel the weight of what he'd done pressing down on him, and it felt suffocating. He'd crossed a line, one that couldn't be erased with a simple apology. He slammed the car door and walked briskly into the precinct. The usual chatter of fellow officers greeted him, but tonight it felt different, like everything was just a little bit off. Griggs tried to ignore the feeling, tried to push it aside, but the nagging sense of dread refused to leave. "Griggs," a voice called from behind. He turned to see Sergeant Hawkins, a grizzled veteran with years of experience. "We need to talk." Griggs's stomach tightened. Hawkins was known for being a no-nonsense kind of guy, and the look on his face told Griggs that this wasn't going to be a pleasant conversation. "Yeah, Sergeant?" Griggs said, trying to mask the unease in his voice. Hawkins didn't waste any time. "I saw the report. What the hell happened out there today? I've been getting calls. People are upset. You didn't just stop some guy for no reason, did you?" Griggs's heart sank. The calls were already coming in. He hadn't thought about the fallout, hadn't considered what would happen once the incident made its way through the grapevine. but now it was too late to turn back. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, Griggs stammered. I just saw him walking in. Don't give me that, Hawkins cut him off, his voice sharp. You know better. You don't stop someone like that just because you feel like it. And that man. He paused, his eyes narrowing as the weight of Griggs's mistake fully sank in. That man was Malcolm King, wasn't it? Griggs swallowed hard. He had hoped Hawkins hadn't heard, but it was clear now that the entire precinct was aware. The shame burned through him, but he couldn't hide from it. I didn't know, Griggs muttered, almost to himself. I didn't recognize him. Doesn't matter if you recognized him or not, Hawkins said coldly. You treated him like he was a nobody. And now it's all over the news. People are already talking, and it won't be long before this blows up. Griggs felt a tightness in his chest. He had been a cop long enough to know what kind of trouble could come from an incident like this. The last thing he needed was to be caught in the middle of a media frenzy, not when things were already tense enough in the city. I'm sorry, Sergeant, Griggs said quietly, his voice strained. I messed up. I'll make it right. I'll talk to him, apologize. Hawkins raised a hand to stop him. It's too late for that now. The damage is done. You've already crossed the line, Griggs. And when people like him, Hawkins pointed toward the door, where the TV in the break room was showing a live broadcast of Malcolm King's press conference. When people like him start speaking up, you better believe this is going to get ugly. Griggs stared at the screen in disbelief. There was Malcolm King, standing tall and dignified, a calm yet intense look in his eyes as he addressed the press. The words were almost drowned out by the growing anxiety inside him, but he didn't need to hear them to know what was coming. King's lawyer is already talking about filing a lawsuit, Hawkins added, his voice laced with concern. This thing's not going away. And it's not just about you anymore. It's about everything you represent. The department is already under fire. Griggs's mind spun. The walls seemed to close in on him, his thoughts racing in 1,000 different directions. His entire career was at risk, and for what? A moment of arrogance? A mistake made in the heat of the moment? He had treated a man like dirt, and now that man's son had made sure the world knew about it. Shit, Griggs muttered under his breath, rubbing a hand across his face. What the hell am I going to do? You need to think long and hard about where you stand right now, Hawkins warned, his tone serious. Because if King presses charges, and it looks like he will, you're looking at a potential career-ending move. Not just you, but the department's reputation will be on the line. You better get your act together before this spirals completely out of control. Griggs stood there in silence, the weight of the situation sinking in. There was no easy way out now. He couldn't take back the way he'd treated Malcolm King. He couldn't undo the damage he'd done. And the worst part? He wasn't even sure if he wanted to. Deep down, he knew he had been wrong. He knew he had let his own prejudice blind him to the truth. But it didn't change the fact that his career, and his future, was hanging by a thread. The morning after the incident, Officer Griggs found himself trapped in a whirlwind of regret and rising tension. His phone had been buzzing nonstop, with news outlets, social media, and colleagues all weighing in on the incident. Malcolm King's name was everywhere, and Griggs couldn't escape the harsh words thrown his way. The video of the confrontation had gone viral, and the public backlash was brutal. Sitting in his small apartment, Griggs couldn't avoid the harsh reality. Each notification seemed like another strike, a reminder of his shame. He tried to ignore the comments, the posts condemning him, but it was impossible. The more he scrolled, the worse it got. One call after another. One message after another. Griggs could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating him. His mother's call made the guilt even more unbearable. "Gregory, what happened?" Her voice trembled with disbelief. "What are you doing? This isn't you." He closed his eyes, trying to hold back the frustration. "Mom, I messed up. I didn't know who he was. I wasn't thinking." His mother's voice softened, but there was an undeniable disappointment. "You need to fix this, son. You need to make things right." Griggs could barely hold it together. "I know," he muttered. "I'll try, Mum. But I don't know if I can." The phone buzzed again, this time a text from Officer Daniels. "We need to talk." "It's bad, Griggs." Griggs's stomach dropped. Daniels had been one of the few who still had his back, but even his patience was wearing thin. He grabbed his jacket and left, heading for the diner where they had agreed to meet. When Griggs arrived, Daniels was already sitting at a booth, the usual calm demeanor replaced by a furrowed brow. He didn't waste time. "Griggs, this is serious. The chief's talking suspension, maybe worse. The whole department's under fire." Griggs felt the weight of his partner's words settle in. "I know. I didn't mean for this to happen, but now it's too late. You need to apologize publicly," Daniels insisted, leaning forward. "Show people that you've learned. This isn't just about saving your job, it's about doing the right thing." Griggs nodded, his mind spinning. He couldn't undo what had been done, but Daniels was right, he needed to own it. But the question gnawed at him, would it be enough? Before he could answer, his phone buzzed again. It was Sergeant Hawkins. "Get to the precinct." Now, Griggs felt a pit in his stomach. He had no choice. He left the diner, making his way to the precinct. The building felt colder than usual. As he walked down the hallway, officers watched him from the corners of their eyes, their gazes heavy with judgment. Inside the chief's office, Chief Wilson was waiting, her face stern. "Griggs," she said, her voice icy. "You've made a mess of this department. What happened out there?" Griggs stood before her, the weight of his mistake crashing down. "I treated him wrong. I humiliated him, and I shouldn't have. I was wrong. I didn't know who he was at the time. But that doesn't excuse what I did." The chief was silent for a moment, her eyes piercing. "The damage is done, Griggs. You've embarrassed us all. We've already had complaints, and now it's public. The media won't stop until they've torn you apart." Griggs hung his head, shame flooding him. "I'll make it right. I'll apologize. I'll do whatever it takes to fix this." Chief Wilson leaned back in her chair. "You've made your bed, now you need to lie in it. Apologizing might not be enough, but it's a start. The department's already been stained by your actions. We'll see if you can salvage anything from this." Griggs's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing. It wasn't going to be easy. Redemption, if it was even possible, would be a long and difficult road. As Griggs left the precinct that day, he knew he couldn't hide from the consequences any longer. His career was in jeopardy, but more than that, his sense of identity, his integrity, was on the line. He had treated a man, an important man, like dirt, and now he had to find a way to make it right, even if that meant sacrificing everything. The phone buzzed in his pocket, and he saw it was Malcolm King's name on the screen. Griggs swallowed hard. It was time to face what he had done. Griggs' mind raced as he stood at the front door of the King residence. His heart thudded in his chest, each beat echoing with the weight of the moment. The path ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back now. He had come to make amends. It had been hours since he had received that call from Malcolm King. The civil rights lawyer had insisted on meeting him face to face, not to lecture, but to hear him out. The request had been a shock to Griggs, who had expected nothing less than fury. But somehow, something in the way King had spoken made him feel like there was still a chance. A chance for redemption. Griggs knocked on the door, and the sound reverberated through the quiet neighborhood. A few seconds passed before the door creaked open, revealing a tall man with a composed demeanor. It was Malcolm King himself, looking every bit the part of the powerful lawyer he was known to be. Griggs swallowed his nerves. "Mr. King?" Malcolm's sharp eyes flickered over him, a subtle hint of disdain, but his voice was calm. "Officer Griggs, I didn't think you'd actually show up." "I know I don't deserve it," Griggs said, his voice low and strained. "But I'm here to apologize. I was wrong. I treated you with disrespect, and I can't undo that. All I can do is ask for a chance to make it right." Malcolm King stood silently for a moment, considering Griggs with a piercing gaze. The silence hung thick between them. Finally, he stepped aside, allowing Griggs to enter. "Let's talk then," King said, his tone cold but not unwelcoming. As Griggs stepped inside, he couldn't help but feel the weight of his guilt. This man had lived a life of principle, fighting for justice, and Griggs had dishonored that with his actions. Every corner of the house seemed to tell a story of King's dedication to his cause: bookshelves lined with legal texts, framed newspaper articles, and photographs from rallies and protests. This wasn't just a lawyer's home. It was a symbol of everything Griggs had failed to understand in that moment on the street. King motioned for him to sit at the dining table. Griggs sat, trying to steady his breath. "You know, Griggs," Malcolm began, his voice sharp, "you're not the first officer to pull over a black man and assume he's a criminal. And you won't be the last. But your ignorance, your arrogance, it's what sets you apart. You didn't just make a mistake. You dehumanized me in front of everyone. You didn't see me as someone worthy of respect. You saw me as a threat." Griggs looked down, his face reddening with shame. He hadn't known then, but now it was all too clear. His actions hadn't just been wrong. They had been rooted in something deeper, a prejudice he hadn't even fully recognized in himself until now. "I was wrong," Griggs repeated, his voice barely a whisper. "I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know I see it now. I see how wrong I was." Malcolm nodded, though the anger in his eyes had yet to fade. "You can't take back what you did. But I respect that you're here, trying to make things right. That's more than most people would do." Griggs felt a small sliver of hope, but it quickly disappeared when Malcolm continued. "But that doesn't change what happened. And you don't get to just walk away from it. This is bigger than you or me, Officer Griggs. This is about systemic issues that have plagued this country for centuries. It's about the way people like you, people with power, choose to treat those who don't have the same privileges. It's about accountability." Griggs' chest tightened. He had thought his apology might be enough. But Malcolm was right. This was bigger than just an apology. The real work would come afterward. And Griggs wasn't sure if he was ready for it. "Is there anything I can do to fix this?" Griggs asked quietly. Malcolm sat back, folding his arms across his chest. "You can start by understanding the impact of your actions, Officer Griggs. You have a platform. You have a voice. You can speak out against the injustice, the racism that is still rampant in the police force, in our justice system. But more importantly, you can be part of the change." Griggs looked up at him, his eyes wide. It wasn't enough to simply say sorry. He had to take action, and it had to be more than just words. "But how?" Griggs asked. "How do I begin to fix something so broken?" Malcolm's expression softened, just slightly. "You start by acknowledging the truth. You start by changing yourself, your mindset. And then, You hold your colleagues accountable. You fight for change from within. That's the only way things will ever get better. Griggs felt his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a conversation about an apology anymore. It was about shifting his entire worldview, about doing the hard, uncomfortable work of confronting the very system he had been a part of. And if I fail? Griggs asked, his voice trembling. Malcolm gave a slight shrug. Failure's not the end, Officer Griggs. It's what you do after you fail that matters. The words hit Griggs like a punch to the gut. He realized then that he couldn't undo the damage he had caused, not fully. But he could take responsibility. He could work for the change Malcolm was talking about. And that was the first step. As Griggs stood to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was just the beginning of something much bigger. It wasn't just about saving his career anymore. It was about saving himself, about fighting against the very prejudices he had been blind to for so long. "Thank you," he said to Malcolm, his voice steady now. "For giving me a chance?" Malcolm didn't respond immediately. Instead, he watched Griggs for a long moment before finally nodding. "Don't thank me yet, Officer Griggs. Thank yourself when you make the change you promised." And with that, Griggs left the King household, his mind racing with everything he had learned. The road ahead was unclear, but one thing was certain: he had to do better. For himself. For the people he had hurt. For the country he had sworn to protect. The days following the conversation at the King household felt like a whirlwind to Griggs. Every moment was filled with tension, his mind torn between his obligations as a police officer and the moral reckoning he was now facing. It was one thing to realize the gravity of his mistake, but another to actually act on it. He couldn't keep running from the truth any longer. The road to redemption was steep, and every step felt like a battle. The first hurdle came quicker than expected: the internal investigation. The department had launched an official review into the incident, and Griggs was placed on administrative leave. Every day felt like an eternity, each moment spent in the anxious anticipation of what the outcome might be. Would they strip him of his badge? Would his career end in disgrace? But the worst part wasn't the wait. It was the silence. The longer he stayed home, the more the weight of his past actions crept into every corner of his mind. The image of Malcolm King's disappointed eyes haunted him at night. Griggs was in his apartment when he received the call. He stared at his phone, his finger hovering over the screen, unwilling to pick it up. It was Daniels. "Griggs," Daniels said, his voice laced with frustration, "they're serious about this. They're not backing down. The chief is pushing for your termination. We need to talk." Griggs clenched his jaw. "What are my options, Daniels? Tell me. I can't sit here forever." Daniels sighed deeply. "You're gonna have to own this, Griggs. You'll need to apologize publicly. Not just some quick statement. You need to go out there in front of the press and let the world see you own your mistake. But even then, I don't know if it'll be enough." The words stung, but Griggs couldn't argue. This wasn't about salvaging his career anymore. This was about doing what was right. The next morning, Griggs stood in front of the cameras. His palms were sweaty, his heart hammering in his chest. The weight of the press conference felt heavier than anything he had experienced on the force. He had been in high-pressure situations before, but nothing compared to this. As the microphones were adjusted, he took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. When he finally spoke, his voice trembled but was filled with the raw sincerity of someone who had come to terms with his actions. "I made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And I need to be accountable for that. The way I treated Mr. King was inexcusable. It was disrespectful, it was wrong, and it was rooted in prejudices that I didn't even know I had. I didn't see him as a person. I saw him through the lens of bias. And that is not who I am, nor who I want to be. The crowd was silent, the camera flashes blinding, but Griggs didn't look away. His words had to mean something. He continued, "I can't change what happened. But I promise you, I will spend every day of my life working to make sure that I never, ever make that mistake again. I will fight for change. I will fight against the prejudice that exists not just in the streets, but within the system. I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I'm asking for a chance to prove that I can be better." As he finished, there was a palpable stillness in the air. For a brief moment, it felt like the world held its breath. Griggs had said what needed to be said, but he knew it wasn't enough to simply speak the words. Now he had to show that he meant them. After the press conference, the world didn't change overnight. Griggs was still under investigation, and the backlash from his fellow officers was swift and brutal. Some condemned him for airing the department's dirty laundry in public, while others said he was simply trying to save face. But there was something different now, a quiet resolve inside Griggs. He had no choice but to face the storm head-on. Days later, the internal review concluded. Griggs was suspended for 6 months and required to attend diversity training and participate in community outreach programs. It wasn't the worst possible outcome, but it wasn't easy. Many in the department were still furious with him. But in that moment, Griggs knew that the punishment was only the beginning of his journey. The real work would begin now. Weeks passed, and Griggs kept his promise. He started working with local community leaders, speaking at forums, and doing everything he could to understand the realities of the people he had once been blind to. It wasn't always comfortable. There were moments when he felt out of place, moments when his own colleagues looked at him with disdain. But with every conversation, with every outreach event, he learned more about the deep-rooted issues that needed to be addressed. And it wasn't just the community that was watching. His fellow officers were watching too. One evening, while Griggs was attending a meeting at a local church, he received a message from Daniels. It was short and to the point. "Griggs, meet me at the precinct. We need to talk." Griggs knew what it meant. He hadn't been sure if the department would ever accept him back, if he could ever fully redeem himself. But this was his chance. When he arrived at the precinct, Daniels was waiting for him. There was a shift in his partner's demeanor, something between surprise and respect. "You did it, Griggs. You changed," Daniels said quietly. "The chiefs noticed it. You've got your badge back." Griggs felt a weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a new beginning. The road to redemption was long, and the work wasn't over. But he had taken the first steps. Malcolm King's words echoed in his mind, "Failure's not the end. It's what you do after you fail that matters." Griggs had failed. But now he was determined to prove that he could be the change. As he stood there, staring at his badge, Griggs knew this moment wasn't just about him. It was about something much bigger. A reckoning that had to happen, not just in him, but in the system as a whole. And while the road ahead would be difficult, he was no longer afraid. He was ready.